All right, due to that fire drill the other day, or it wasn't really a drill, I don't know what it was, but we kind of were stopped in our tracks trying to discuss this book one of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So I just want to present a brief summary as I can of what's going on here in book one in Aristotle setting up this idea of our ultimate best life and our goals in life and how that connects to action in general. And so let's read very carefully this the beginning of book one, and we'll just kind of recap this kind of quickly. Aristotle begins by saying, every craft and every line of inquiry, and likewise every action and decision seems to seek some good. That is why some people were right to describe the good as what everything seeks. There's a lot going on in this first sentence here, more than meets the eye. Aristotle begins by this analysis of human action. And Aristotle will say that human action is interesting. It will always seek an end. In other words, every single thing that we do, every pursuit that we have is for the sake of some end or goal. Now, this end or goal in philosophy gets to be known as a telos. That every single action has a telos. It has a purpose. And this is kind of compelling because what do we mean by our actions? Well, of course, there's the things that I intend to do through choice, like go to class, has a particular end, has a particular goal. I go to class in order to pass the class preps. I get dressed in order to be warm or to look nice. But I also do things like breathe. And there's a purpose of breathing. I do things like blink my eyes. And those are also human actions, even if they're not chosen. And Aristotle says something moreover about these ends that we have in life. He says these ends are ends, right? The end is an end because it is good. In other words, it shows up as a good. At the very least, it's a good insofar as it appears to me as being good. And Aristotle has some different descriptions of what would make something show up as good for us. Like, why would we call something good and therefore seek it in human action? And Aristotle will talk about three senses in which we could talk about what is naturally good or bad, something that we try to avoid through human action. What do we mean by no, it's naturally good? Well, the first category, we talked about this in class the other day, is usefulness. Then anytime something shows up as useful for us, we'll seek it as a good. For example, if you were to walk down the street and you were to encounter a green piece of paper, you would probably pick it up, probably because you would anticipate that it is money. And why do you want money? Not because you're fond of green pieces of paper, because you can see what it can do for you, right? Aristotle will also talk about naturally good in this sense in terms of certain friendships. You might have a friendship with a person that's essentially a useful friendship. You're friends with the person because of something that the person can do for you or you can do for them. I suggest a lot of your friendships with classmates are like that. This kind of friendship that lasts insofar as you're in class, because it's, you can study together and stuff, but as soon as you graduate or as soon as the class is done, the friendship is done. Something similar, another sense in which something is naturally good, Aristotle, is insofar as something is pleasant, right? Insofar as you grab some pleasure from it. Now, pleasure is actually a really fascinating and interesting topic, and we're going to explore it in much more detail. It's kind of, there's multiple senses in which we need to understand pleasure. But it's pretty obvious. If you think you enjoy something, you'll seek it. We could also, Aristotle later on will talk about pleasure as a type of friendship. You could have a friendship of pleasure where you enjoy being with the person and you take sort of pleasure. They're fun. They're fun at a party or something like that, and therefore you're a friend. But it's just a different sense of friendship. Now, there's this highest sense in which Aristotle says something is good by nature, beyond what's useful and what's pleasant, and he calls that the kalon. Now, the kalon is important because it's partially because it's a very confused topic. What do we mean by the kalon? Well, we get a lot of strange translations. Even in the text that we'll use, the kalon is translated as, if I remember correctly, the noble or the fine. And those are fine, I guess, words. But the best translation of the kalon is the beautiful. Aristotle says that if we encounter something as beautiful, we immediately see it as good, and in seeing it as good, we're immediately drawn towards that thing, right? Now, beauty needs to be understood as more than just something that's pretty, right? I made a distinction that helps to kind of think of beautiful as it's more than just the way something physically looks. It's more than saying something that you're attracted to something. Like, say you were used the word hot. If you said that person is hot, you're saying you're in some sense attracted to them. But beauty, it's more compelling than just being attracted to the thing. I think it's in a sense of that you find a reason to honor something, or think about the love of adoration, that you adore something. And Aristotle would say that sometimes we encounter something that is just beautiful. Not just someone's face, but a kind of action, that someone acts beautifully, right? There was a beautiful performance of a song, not just because the song sounded nice, but there was something about the entire performance that was beautiful. There was a landscape that was beautiful. It's something wonderful to behold, something that you feel honored just to be present to. And that's what Aristotle is talking about, that it's not just about things that seem useful to us or things that we kind of like because of the pleasure, but there's something even more compelling, this idea of beauty. All right, the second aspect of all this then is to not just think about what is good by nature, but what is in fact bad by nature, things that we try to avoid, right? And so the correlate of usefulness, what's the opposite of something being useful? Well, for Aristotle, that would be harmful, right? That if something harms us, by nature, we seek to avoid it, right? If something, the opposite of pleasantness is painful, right? And the opposite of kalon, or beautiful, is the wicked or the ugly. I like the word ugly, right? And it puts in stark relief why, how this even kind of relates to moral questions. A lot of the moral good and bad that we tend to think about in human action, ultimately for Aristotle, will be defined in terms of what is a beautiful act or an ugly act. The reason why certain acts ought not to be done, in part, is because of their inherent ugliness, and part of the reason that certain acts are to be done is because of their inherent beauty, right? And so, then in this book one, Aristotle will analyze all of our actions, and he says that, again, every action that we do seeks some end, and that end is an end because it shows up as good. It'll show up as a good in any of these ways, as being something that's useful, pleasant, or beautiful, or as it's good to do an act because you can in some ways avoid what's bad. In other words, avoid harm, avoid pain, and avoid ugliness, right? Now, an interesting kind of dimension here is Aristotle then, in Book 1, Chapter 1, I'm not going to pull out the text right here, but then he breaks down human actions into two further categories, which perhaps might be reminiscent of things that we talked about with Glaucon in the Republic. And Aristotle will say, okay, well, if we consider human acts, they are related to their ends in two ways, right? How an act is related to its end, right? There are two essential relationships of an act to its end. Aristotle will say that act could be a kind of act that we call an activity, or that act could be a kind of act that we call a process. And what's the difference? Aristotle will say that a process is an action whose end is separate from the act itself. The end is separate from the act itself. In other words, the end shows up as some further goal, right? So, for instance, I could walk across the street, and the walking itself is not my goal, but the getting to the other side of the street is. Or a carpenter could choose to build a piece of furniture, and it's not the building of the piece of furniture that is, it's not the building that's the goal, but it's having the piece of furniture built that's the goal. That's a process. how is that distinct from an activity? Where an activity is where the end is the act. The entire goal of your doing is to do the act itself, right? And if you were to go on a walk on the beach, right? Frequently, you go on a walk on the beach not because you have somewhere to go, but because you just want to walk on the beach. And sometimes you might think, another example, sometimes think about something like music. Why would you listen to music? Well, sometimes you might listen to music because it's a process, because it helps you calm and relax in order to do something else. But sometimes you might listen to music just because the music is worth listening to. You just want to listen to it, right? And so it's an interesting kind of thing that if we go back to this, the senses in which we call something good here, and we kind of find this interesting relationship that if I call something kalon or beautiful, right, that which is kalon or truly a beautiful thing to be done is an activity in perhaps almost the fullest sense. It's something that's most worthy of, oh, God damn it. Come on, lights. I have this lights on these motion sensors. There we go. Gosh, pissing me off. What was I saying? An activity, right, is most fully sort of shown in this idea of something that is beautiful, something that's worthy of honoring and adoring. An activity that is itself. Kalon is precisely something that's that the end goal is the act itself in many cases, right? Where we see usefulness, right? This idea of usefulness over here is very clearly connected to a process, right? That the reason that we do an act that's a process is because it's some ways useful. And so what we see here then in Aristotle from here is trying to determine how all of our acts are ultimately connected to a higher end. And what Aristotle will ultimately say here is that not all acts can be processes. And so what we're going to look at next is how ultimately this structure of human action will have its fulfillment in this idea of the highest end of all human actions. We'll look at that next.